Good evening. Good evening. Okay. Well, we are now to part 4, believe it or not. I mean, this is only number 12, but when you do it a couple times a month, which is fine. I'm just trying to keep everything connected. We're going to be beginning the translation portion. Now, what I'll say, any of these portions we could do weeks on. Okay, we could do a lot more. This has been an overview, and that was by intention. Translation, especially when we're talking about the early ones and the process through which different people did different things and which ones happened. I'm glossing over a fair amount of that to get to English translations, mainly because that's what will make the most difference, or at least be the most impact to those gathered here. But there are other things that happen in history. English and German are the two languages that have the most translations by far of the Bible. And that's just historic. The reason there were so many German ones is because Protestantism with Luther and all of that originated in German areas, and they did a lot of translation into German. English kind of took over because, well, English became the general language. Like I said last week, we've moved from transmission, so that's understanding how the autographs of the originals got copied, how accurate they are to be the base for an original language to move into a translation. They're very, 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 very accurate. God's hand is in that. But as we hop into this part, we start moving into more of the realm of subjectivity with translators. And we leave the realm of perfection and enter into the realm of happy imperfection. The thing to remember, and I'm just going to get ahead of something, just because a translation is imperfect does not mean it's unuseful. Jesus translated from, or quoted from, an imperfect translation in his day. The apostles did. So something that gets the information out is valuable. This morning we're going to be looking basically at early translations. We're going to look at a few as we move toward, we're heading toward basically the King James and that era. So this is going to be kind of a bridge lesson. There's going to be a lot of description of terms, and they're going to look at some figures and stuff. A lot of information. I'm not trying to overload you, but that's what we'll be doing this evening. To set it up, though, we got to define a few terms. There are some terms associated with translation which are not correctly understood and or defined. Don't worry, it's not that big a deal. There won't be a test later. But the term translation itself, what does translation really mean? Okay. Which is not always the same in structure and syntax and all that. Okay, now Doyle hit on something there when he said a translation is rendering of one, I have it as one composition from one language into another. That's the most basic form. You included that it be commonly understood and readable, which is an important facet. Because when you start doing straight translations, I think there'll be a piece of that in the next one, of something lining it up word for word, it can become very unreadable, which is true. The interpretive side is going to come down to how easy to read you want it to be. There are two schools of thought. Be more strict to the original structure, because it's more of what the original intention was, or try to make it more easy or commonly give it flow where it is understood in the common tongue, but we get maybe slightly further away from the original rendering. And reality is usually somewhere in the middle. A lot of the sliding scale with the translation is going to come down to readability. So that idea will come into play. Really, you're just taking one composition and trying to render it in another. When it comes to the Bible, that's coming from Hebrew, Aramaic in the Old Testament, Greek in the New Testament, and rendering it into English, in our case, or Spanish, or whatever. problem is a lot of the Bibles that we have had historically aren't that one-to-one thing. They've actually gone down a long path of varied renderings. And that'll be, well, let's see, let's look at the next term. Transliteration. Has anyone ever heard the term transliteration? Hey, what does it mean, Eric?
What I've heard is that you just kind of create words because you cannot find an exact translation and you make it a little better.
Okay. Yes, except for usually when they say they cannot find, they just don't want to find. It's probably the better way to put it. Yeah, you're rendering, well, here's an example. Here are two examples. You're rendering the original form. Now, technically the Greek there is anglicized, meaning I have taken the Greek words and used English equivalents, mainly because I mean, if you want, angelos looks like this. Actually, that's an 8, actually. Angelos looks like that, but that's probably not going to mean much. The word angelos in Greek sounds a whole lot like what? Angel. We just stole this part. Angel becomes angel, becomes engel, for the engel in English, by the way, the angles. In a whole lot of history, there's all kinds of stuff that goes with that term. Anglo, it comes from that root word. What does angelos, well, when I say, well, obviously it means angel. Do you know what the original word literally means? Messenger. Now, the heavenly creatures sent to do God's bidding are the messengers of God, so it's a fitting term. But we've actually created this new title for them that isn't in the original language, either in Hebrew or Greek, weirdly enough. They're literally just the messengers of God, okay? And you can break some people's brains when you point that out because they start going, what? But it also actually explains a few things. For instance, in the Revelation, you have the angels of each of the 7 churches, and that creates this whole notion that each church has its like individual guardian angel and all these different things, when it literally could just be the messenger of the churches, which could just be the guy who gets their mail. Because and the end result is still the same. This letter went to their messenger. Am I saying that's the only interpretation? No, but when you have angel in English, we created this term. And there's a lot of things that are wrapped up in that term. They really weren't in the original language because we didn't want to translate it as messenger. There was a word that existed, but for whatever reason, the translators wanted to give it something of greater purpose. Baptizo is another big example. Baptizo. What does baptizo mean? To immerse. To immerse. To dip, to plunge. A pithy example used in common Greek in the day would be when you're washing dishes and you plunge them into a basin to get everything off of them instead of just trying to get a little tiny bit off of just, you plunge them in, but because to translate baptizo as immersion would cause some controversies with doctrines that had existed for quite a long time, around the time of King James, who himself had been sprinkled, they created this new word, baptize, which has its own form. There are actually a lot of these in English, a lot. Evangelist comes from the root for gospel, which is euangelion. An evangelist could literally be translated as a gospeler, because gospel is euangelion, the good news. Good messenger, in essence. Anyway, I could do this for a while. Most of our terms for elders, actually, a lot of them, presbyters, comes from presbyteros. Anyway, transliteration. That's not a translation, though. You aren't taking a word and its meaning and bringing it over into an English word with its own meaning. You're just making a new word. And this will happen. So occasionally this will enter into play. Another term is a version. This comes up a lot. You have the King James Version, the New International Version, the Revised Standard Version. Only of those 3 is the NIV technically a version, believe it or not. Because a version is supposed to be a translation from the original to the new. It's not based upon a different one. It's not revising something else. A version, in the terminology that's used, I don't know why. It's supposed to be, this is a new rendering that we just did, as opposed to a revision or a revised version where you revise an earlier version into more contemporary language. This would be like the Revised Standard, which revised the American Standard, which revised the King James. There's a whole thread there. That's a revision. But the difference is when you're going to, and this will become more important as we're looking at translations, when you're trying to set it up, instead of going from the original to whatever it is you're making, I'll put the version there, so from the original to the version, you are relying on a chain of several others before it to get to where you're at. Well, if you're this far removed from the original, is there any bias that's going to come up into the choice of words for translation? Every step of the way. The goal isn't necessarily to create a new Bible for contemporary audiences or common tongue as language evolves. It's to take what was and just make it a bit more modern. Confusingly enough, there are translations like the New American Standard Bible, which is a version, had nothing to do with the Old American Standard at all, but still used that name and called it new. New why? In what way? It isn't. It's just its own thing. So, yeah. Terms get thrown around with Bibles. They did, but the thing was, in 1977, ASV wasn't really all that well known. So that's kind of it was an interesting choice, but you're probably correct of what they were doing is they were trying to connect to that form. There is an old international version, if you know. I don't know much about it, but I have my great-grandfather's Bible from the 1900s, 19-teens is in that, and the New International Version has nothing to do with it. Anyway, so those are the definition of those terms. There's more technical ones we can get into, but I wanted to look at those. So, does that make those things make sense? All right. Why do we need translations? What's the reason? Have in your own language. English is greatly blessed in this way. We have dozens, if not hundreds now. We have bunches. It's kind of slowed a little bit, but there have been version after version. For a while there, it was like everyone was just putting one out. German has a lot of them. A lot of the languages don't. A lot of languages have one. There are 4, as of the dates of the figures I have here, this may have improved with some of the projects that are being done, especially by some even in the church that are trying to get translated versions in certain languages out in mission fields. So this might have gotten a little better. But as of a few years ago, there were only 405 languages with an adequate Bible. 1,000 of them, 1,034 with an adequate New Testament. You tend to start with the New Testament. 883 other languages that had some pieces, so maybe the Gospels or Acts or a chunk or Psalms, and still 3,000 or more languages in the world that have no translated form of the Bible in their own tongue. Now, there are a lot of areas where you have a lot of oral tradition and local language groups that raise this number up quite a bit, but still there's a large chunk of the world that doesn't have translations. While we sit and fight over which is best for us in English, there are some out there that have none. It's a problem. All right, so really, like I said, this is about early translations. So to kind of set the stage and move us toward where we'll be, we're just going to kind of move through a little bit of history. We talked about the Aramaic Targums a little bit before. Back after the Babylonian captivity, the general populace of the Israelites, they lost the ability to read and understand Hebrew. And that seems incredible. That seems pretty wild. I mean, it was only 70 years. What could change in 70 years? I mean, seriously, well, 70 years ago, what, 1954? Has anything changed in 70 years? couple generations, language changes, mores change. Now, it's not just the culture, but imagine you're a part of a distinct culture and you're uprooted. So say the population of the county all of a sudden found itself in, I'll just pick Uzbekistan again because I like to go there, Kyrgyzstan or something, and you're there for 70 years. And you have to survive by interacting with the people. You have to survive by not being closed off, adopting the culture. And in this case, it's a more dominant culture because they've conquered you. You forget they were given names in this other language. Just think about that. You show up and you don't have your name. You have your name rendered in this local form. And that's how they're going to address you. Because if you remember, Daniel is given a different name, the three friends. We remember the three friends by their Aramaic names more than their Hebrew names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not their Hebrew names. There was a lot of pressure to conform in that way. So they lost it. But they could still speak. They could still communicate. Did that mean that once they lost Hebrew, and not everyone did, the scribes kept it, they maintained it because they were able to keep it, but the general populace, the people, the hoi polloi is the Greek term, the general people, does that mean that they were hopeless? No. They just needed someone to render it for them, which started the Targums of various books of the Old Testament. The scribes orally translated the Old Testament into Aramaic. They did it kind of in an not a terribly formal way, because they were never really meant to be authoritative. They were just meant to be aids to the people to learn, and then they could be redirected back to the Hebrew. But that was probably, that's arguably the earliest example of a biblical translation. That isn't to say that maybe some of the wisdom of Solomon, for instance, wasn't translated into Egyptian or Ethiopian or any of those people that would come to visit him. I bet it was. So there are probably examples of that in isolated ways. But a big formal translation of anything in the Bible, beyond that, didn't happen until the Septuagint, the 70. Jews living in conquered Greek areas, after time and time, started speaking Greek. Weirdly enough, they tended to hold on to Aramaic as well, because the Greeks didn't impose their culture on quite in the same fashion. I mean, they did, but it was more economic. It came down to if you wanted to interact in the marketplace, you needed to speak Greek. Yeah? For some reason, that was like the place they were. I don't know the specific reason why. All I know is there were more in Alexandria than in Jerusalem proper. It may have had to do with the fact that Alexandria was a city of a conquered, a built city by Alexander himself in Egypt, not far from Cairo or Thebes, that area there, with the Nile Delta. And so it might have just become, since that was such a center of trade, and they're very good at trade and markets and banks and that kind of thing, that just became a good spot for them, especially as a launching point on the Mediterranean. Israel didn't have quite the same degree of ports on the Mediterranean. They had Joppa, they had different places, but they couldn't compete with Tyre, which was later conquered, or different places. But if they had access to Alexandria, that could be part of it. That's just me. That's not definitive, but that would make what made sense. But historically, there were more there than in Jerusalem. And they were all over the different places. Alexandria is important because this is that center of learning. Alexandria, for many years after this, even after the church came into existence, would become kind of a center of scholarship. Between it and Antioch would become two different schools of thought in the church. That's a church history thing, which is its own woo. But Alexandria was the site of the Great Library. We only know so much, because again, we're reading someone else's mail, we're reading historical accounts of a structure that was destroyed. We haven't seen it in person. But the ostensible goal, what was the purpose of the Great Library? that's a pretty strange goal to house all the world's knowledge. Where would that come from? Well, it's a very Greek thing. A lot of their philosophers, their love of Sophia, wisdom, to the point they personified her as not just a woman like Solomon would in the Proverbs, but turned her into a goddess, and that's its own problems. But there was this obsession with compiling knowledge from everywhere. They're obsessed with learning anything new. We saw this later in the Areopagus in Athens. So yeah, it didn't matter where it came from, who wrote it, they wanted it in this library. And that included the Old Testament. The problem was, the Jews could show, and they could say, hey, okay, here's some scrolls. You know, here's some spares that we didn't destroy when we were making copies. If you really want them, here you go. But it's in Hebrew. They wanted it in Greek. So the story goes, apocryphal most likely, that they got 70 or 72 scribes together. There's differ on the number. 72 makes more sense because it's a multiple of 12, but it is referenced in the Roman numeral as the 70. They got together, were divvied up different pieces of the Old Testament, went into 72 separate rooms, and translated it. Whether that's how it really happened, The point was, though, the Greeks didn't come and just try to make this a translation themselves. They got the Jewish scholars to do it, which is kind of surprising in a way, because you're asking them to take their Bible and translate it into the language of basically their conquerors. But they did it. It was stored there. But it didn't stay there. In time, the Hebrew Old Testament was one of these works being translated into Greek sometime between 250 and 150, during the time of silence. After Malachi, before John the Baptist shows up on the scene as a voice crying in the wilderness. Somewhere in there this happens. And there's debate over to what drove this. Was it an order from one of the Seleucid kings? Possibly. Was it something they did under duress? Is it something they did willingly? That history there's only so much information we have. We have the books of Maccabees, which are not inspired, that give the account of the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes, who was Antiochus IV. If I remember right, he desecrated the temple by offering up a swine on the altar. And that was the tipping point and rose in the revolution. That was what the abomination of desolation was. And they defeated him for a time, but they couldn't hold out their own. That term abomination of desolation would come to mean great desolation to come, which was a type of what the Romans would later do. This was the first true translation of the Old Testament in terms of completing the whole thing in its entirety with a system in place where you're taking it from one language to another for a specific intention. And it became the commonly quoted Old Testament in Jesus' day. Think about that. When he goes into the synagogue to quote from the scrolls, he's reading from Hebrew in that case. But when he goes out to the people, he's quoting from the Greek translation of it. Because there will be differences that show up. And every New Testament writer quotes from the Septuagint. Why?
Did the Jewish population during those times of the Greek translation, did the Jewish people of the time embrace it?
They had to have, because it's what they knew. When Jesus is in, like, the Sermon on the Mount, well, I don't know if he quotes anything from it. Just pick a position, just like a situation when he makes a quotation, he's quoting from it. Is he going to quote from something that his audience is unfamiliar with?
I was referring to the time of 250, 150 BC.
Oh.
Was it received by the Jewish people?
We don't know. We don't know exactly how it transitioned from oddity, how it moved from this thing at the Great Library, which could have just ended up being stored there. All kinds of stuff was stored there. Historically, it could have just been shelved and no one cared, but for whatever reason, it was picked up. It's suggested largely because more and more of the people, while they spoke Aramaic in conversation, or they're speaking Greek in the marketplaces and different things, that they started to use it as they might have started to use it as a teaching medium. It might have even been what we have to guess, and I wish I could give you more definitive things. It's very possible that at the synagogue, the scribe who was familiar with Hebrew would read a section and then teach in Greek, because everyone gathered there wouldn't necessarily know the Hebrew.
I always perceived it as the use of the Greek was to be available to all listeners, not just a specific few.
Well, here's the thing. How does that transition from one language to another help? What is the New Testament written in? It's written in Greek. So when you have this transition from the old law to the new, the church comes into existence and it's spreading out. And it starts with the Jews and then it opens up to the Gentiles. You create God, and however he did, he created a bridge where he can now talk about Old Testament things, even to Gentiles who may not be as familiar with it, in their own language. And it's still authoritative because they're quoting from, they're not having to explain as much. Occasionally there's little things that come up. John actually will say, and at that time it meant this, or because it's almost as if Hebrew after the destruction of Jerusalem was starting to wane. He had to actually explain what some of these things meant. But, and occasionally you'll have those cases where you'll have two, like Tabitha is also Dorcas. So you can see this kind of a transition going on. But God he used one language for a purpose, and now he's using another language, and it's shifting from one to the other. Sorry, you had a hand? Okay. Yeah, it helped in the sharing. Let's see. Oh, yeah, the legend, 6 men taken from the 12 tribes. So 6 men each, 12 tribes, 72. Took 72 days to complete it, or something. The legend. It's the one quoted by Christ and the New Testament writers. Well, the New Testament writers quoting Christ, quoting it, basically. It's the one that will be used. That's why you'll run into certain variations of Psalms, especially. But famously, people get worked up because Hebrews will quote a psalm as saying one thing, and you go to the psalm and it renders it slightly differently. You're like, what happened? It's because of a translation choice. Created you a little lower than angels versus a little lower than God. Yeah, it's one of those things. So, okay. Moving forward from that, past the biblical element. Now, the Septuagint wasn't inspired. It was a translation. It had flaws. It actually had quite a few. That doesn't mean people didn't quote from it. And any quotation from it is inspired. Beyond that, the church spreads out into the world, and it's going to either stay in that Greek form, and a lot of the Eastern Roman Empire is going to be speaking Greek. But then eventually it's going to have to be moving into different languages. The Latin Vulgate becomes a very famous piece in all this. Now, when I went over this, particularly in school, we spent a lot of time here. Anyone here speak Latin? Not I. I just am going to mention it in the chain of events, okay? If you have more questions, that's great. We can dig into it. But the reason the Vulgate came into existence in the western half of the empire, Latin was more commonly spoken. Latin was the official language of the Roman Empire. Now, why would that be? It's pretty obvious. It was their language, right? The lingua franca in Latin means common tongue. Frank language was Latin. This would actually wane over time as the empire fell in the west. The capital got moved to Constantinople, and they became the Byzantines, which is more Greek. I love history, but I don't know if anyone else really cares about that. Anyway, they needed something in the west because Latin was a major language of the day. There were other minor ones around. You see a lot of them listed in Acts 2, when they're speaking in the languages of other people. Phrygian and Georgian, actually. Ancient Georgian's one, a bunch of these different ones. Not from the South, we're talking, the Caucasus. Latin was the official language of Rome and the common language of the West. As early as AD 200, so turn of the 3rd century into the 2nd century, Latin translations of the Bible were being made, known as the Old Latin translations. There were some of them around. We don't have a whole lot of copies of them, but they existed. And then in AD 382, so this is after Constantine proclaims the Edict of Toleration in the early 300s. Christianity is no longer persecuted. It's the official church of Rome. Catholicism is kind of born here. Things get messy. But we benefit from what people did, whether they did it for the right or the wrong reasons. Okay? Jerome was a scholar in his day. And he was commissioned by the Bishop of Rome. This is before they really solidified on Rome. They still had the 5 C's. To revise these texts into a standard Latin text. You had these old Latin translations, and since they were kind of centering their power there, they wanted an official one in Latin that would be their Bible for their purposes. They were perfectly happy for him to just throw something together that sounded close. They seriously didn't want him to go too deep into this. However, Jerome did something unusual. Up until this point, there had been a chain of translations. So you have, I'm going to zoom this so we can have this kind of spot here. You had the Old Testament in Hebrew, right? That becomes the Septuagint in Greek. And it was from this, of the Old Testament, that a lot of these Latin translations were coming. Okay? They would also be taking the New Testament directly from Greek as well. But there were two levels of separation for the Old Testament. So you had some kind of things filtered through. Can you imagine something that's been from one language to another language to another language, how much telephone that could be after a while? Dun, dun, dun. Jerome did something strange. He decided to translate the Old Testament straight from the Hebrew itself. You might think, well, of course, why wouldn't he do that? But this was considered like incredibly profound as an idea, because that meant he had to learn Hebrew. So he put together a pretty good Latin text and a true version, because it's coming from the original, the Old, and the original, the New. Did he allow some of the other Latin to enter in? Whatever. The irony is, he puts this out. He had to actually travel to Palestine and learn from scribes and various people there how to even read and understand Hebrew. He spent years doing this. People mocked him for this. He was wasting church funds. He was, whatever. He unveils his translation, the Vulgate, as it's called. Vulgate actually isn't a kind term. From where the English word vulgar, you know where that comes from? The Latin idea of the common, the lesser people. This was the commoner's Bible. People hated it. They criticized it. For years, they didn't like it. Then time passed. And then eventually the Vulgate became, and in some ways, depending on who you ask, the official text of the Catholic Church, and you could never change it or do anything to it. So when it comes out, it's considered common, it's what everybody knows, ew. But a few hundred years pass, not only can it never be changed, people stopped speaking Latin and needed it in their own tongue, and you couldn't move away from it. Something that was created originally to help the people have it in their own language became the barrier. See how time makes things crazy sometimes? They held on to that version as being godlike forever, almost like some of the King James. They were obsessed with it. It is up until Vatican II, back in I think it was the 60s, when they got rid of the need for Latin in the liturgical services and you could use the common tongue. A lot of Catholics consider that a mistake. I have no opinion on it because it's Catholicism, but up until, like even the 1960s, and not that long ago, the Vulgate was still the one you used. And as we'll see with early English translators, because that's the last couple we're going to look at, rendering anything from that source. We're not even talking from the original sources. Taking anything out of the Latin sources was considered a capital crime. You fast forward to the early English translators, and I'm moving into 14th century. We've moved a lot, and we're getting close to the King James. So that's kind of the goal, and then we'll pick up next month, I guess, with those. But I need to bridge this gap. There's two men we're just going to talk about for a few minutes, and then we'll kind of wind us out. It's John Wycliffe and William Tyndale. Wycliffe was an outspoken religious reformer as part of the Reformation. That whole discussion is a thing into itself because while they had some very good, true complaints, their solutions were not necessarily biblical either. It's just one of those give and takes about church history, right? But he was the first, at least there's argument, but he was the first, it seems to be, who translated a complete Bible into the English language, or at least the English of his day. Now, it would have been even Middle English. It was even before Elizabethan English. We probably wouldn't recognize it, but it was, the point was getting the Bible into something that the general people could understand. Now, why could the general people not understand the Bible at this point? Well, even if they could read and write in English or German or French or any of those languages, and French was considered a more highbrow language than English and German at the time, they still couldn't understand it because it was in Latin. Who read and spoke Latin? The priests, mostly. It had become an insular thing where they just created their own proto-language in their ivory tower. Some people might have studied it as scholarships or if they had money and time on their hands, but generally it was just the church talking to herself. And I speak that as the Catholic, not the church. This religious order speaking to herself. So when she gets up and goes, blah, 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 I don't speak Latin, but blah, 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 and you don't understand what's being said, they could be saying anything, and they were. They were directing all kinds of things. They didn't want the audience to understand what they were saying. Which is ironic, because what has been the problem we have seen throughout this discussion today? When the people don't understand what the text is, what do? They want to make it so that people can understand it. Except all of a sudden they didn't. Scholars tried to translate it into common languages. German, English, French somewhat, but those are the two biggies. And like I said, it was a capital crime. They could be burned at the stake, executed, because it was an affront to God. Because, God doesn't want people to know his word, right? Is that the theme you've ever gotten from the Bible? Even in the darkest days of Judah, like we talked about earlier, if the people wanted to find what God had to say, they could have found it somewhere because it was in their language. Think about that, Wycliffe is the first who seems to have translated the complete Bible. The thing is, he didn't translate a version, he translated a revision or a down the line, because he used the Vulgate as his source. The reason was that's what he had. And you know what? That's a good start. At least it's something, but it could use better. But basically what that means is now you have Hebrew and Greek feeding into Latin that's then feeding into English. Okay? So if anything broke down at this point in the translation, and to be fair, Jerome had a pretty decent translation. He didn't actually take that many liberties. But it was something. It was a starting point. But it wasn't, it could be better. Then you have William Tyndale, born when Columbus was sailing the ocean blue, apparently, in 1492. Died in 1536. We know exactly when. He died on October 6, 1536, under the old dating system. I don't want to be under the new calendar, but don't worry about that. We know to the day. He was a scholar of Hebrew and Greek. What he accomplished was, Wycliffe's stuff is being smuggled, it's being shared about. And you can imagine the effect that would have. You get this little, what is this? Oh, this is what the Bible says. Oh, these are words of Jesus. These are words of Paul. Oh, St. Paul? Yeah. This is talking about how we're supposed to be. Okay, so it's talking about the priest and all that. No, it doesn't say anything about that. You imagine what kind of effect that starts having? That's circulating around. Well, Tyndale, he's a scholar of both Hebrew and Greek. Makes you wonder how he was able to secure those roles given what he does with it. Maybe he was connected in the right way. I don't know. But he used these skills to create an actual version. An actual version. Now, notice the date there. William was forced to flee England in 1524 in order to finish this work, and his translation had to be smuggled back into England. He fled from England. What gets confusing about this now is you have Henry creating the Anglican Church, and then depending who the king or the queen is, they would flip from that or back to Catholicism or back to that or back to Catholicism. It gets really, really confusing. And at a certain point, the Catholics took back over with Bloody Mary, and he had to flee to the mainland, to the continent, to France, just to finish this, or he would have been killed. He continued to revise his work. He finished it in the 1520s, but he kept working on it up until his death. But notice the date I'm giving you, the 1520s. This is the first time in English we're getting a true version, the 1520s. There's a lot of dead time there, even in England. His New Testament would provide the basis for all successive revisions of the English Bible. There will later be the Bishop's Bible, and a few of them before we'll start talking about when King James VI of Scotland became James I of England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland. And will commission a version in 1611. Very famous. That should be something you're like, oh, I know that. But it had only been not even 100 years since any real true version had made it into the common tongue in England. And again, this is interesting to us because we speak that language, but the same story could be told in some other places. Miles Coverdale printed the first English Bible after William's death, based largely upon his work. Wouldn't be the first printed Bible. That would have been done by Gutenberg. It was the very first thing he printed on his press. I believe it was a German Bible, though, which would make sense. But William Tyndale, what was he guilty of? What crime did he commit? He definitely challenged the authority that happened to be in power at the day. And again, it changed with the monarch in England at this period. But ultimately, it would come down to challenging that authority. He was kidnapped, imprisoned, and continued to work on his stuff. They locked him in a space, in a tower. But he had enough freedom to continue writing and studying. Until finally he was found guilty of heresy in in August 1936. Heresy, offense against God. He was guilty of heresy. It's interesting that word is used because it had kind of evolved in time over time, but heresy was a very serious thing under the old law, right? What was heresy under the old law? Okay, well, there's the false in there, but like, yeah, heresy would be something which was against what God taught and akin to blasphemy in those terms. What heresy did this man teach? If he was rendering what the Bible was,
He was making available to the common man the Bible, circumventing the priests' stealthy use of their authority.
he was challenging the authority of man, who was using the name of God to do what they wanted. This isn't anything actually new in history. It happened before. Think of many prophets who would challenge a king. Sometimes those prophets, on a rare occasion, would challenge a king for claiming something in God's name, even, not an idol that wasn't true. Well, he was found guilty of heresy in August of 1536, and he was burned at the stake October 6th, 1536, burned alive, crying, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And not 80 years later, a different king would commission an English Bible for not only the common use, but the official use in English churches, Anglican churches. The worm was starting to turn on that, and it had come to the common tongue. So, I don't know. That was kind of a bridge lesson. That was a lot of history, a lot of just kind of things, but I was trying to bring us to this point. Because what we'll be looking at is some of those earlier translations. I'm going to avoid the Catholic ones. I might mention them in passing, but the King James, and the ASV, RSV, and then some of the more modern ones. And then maybe there might be an addendum. We'll see where we land if there's any questions of various things. So, any thoughts thus far?
What happened to his work after he was burned alive?
Coverdale, it's right there. Miles Coverdale saved it, and he printed it on probably a clone of a Gutenberg-style press. It was one of the first printed English Bibles on a press. Coverdale's one that gets the credit for printing the first Bible, but it was Tyndale's work that he printed that had been smuggled in. Tyndale was dead.
Is that still available today?
I think you might be able to find something like that. Some of these, the King James took all the oxygen up of everything that was at the time. So like the Bishop's Bible and some of the other ones that were around, those are just named for different works that kind of existed during this in-between time off and on. They kind of were lost to history because the King James became the thing. So I'm not sure if you can find a Coverdale or not. It wouldn't shock me if you could, but I don't know. Nope. And then you and yeah. They weren't necessarily all able to write or read. Reading and writing was a much more involved process just because the materials were much more involved than what we have today. And they were known as men of letters that did that. That doesn't mean that they were fools. They were typically if not trilingual. They knew a lot of language. Your common person just doing their job. A fisherman, let's say like John or James or whomever, they would speak Aramaic probably conversationally, but they had to know Greek to engage in commerce. They knew both of those at least. So that makes them bilingual already. And who knows, they learn a lot of Hebrew as young men and the young women as well, each in their own form of schooling that they had at the synagogues. They may not have been as well versed in the Hebrew, but they would be familiar enough with certain phrases and various things for certain. Yeah, no, they encouraged a lot of that. And they did so in the years of silence, partly because the Greeks would show up and try to encourage their youth, their young people, to embrace, to Hellenize, to embrace Greek culture, to go to the gymnasiums where there was a lot of stuff, or go to the theaters where there was a lot of stuff. They were both negative social pressures. And so the reaction was, this is where a lot of Phariseeism came into play, actually. It was trying to keep the young people pure from that and keep to their Hebrew roots. It just kind of blew up from there. Some of the people did become more Greek. That's where a lot of the Hellenistic names came into play. That's why you had that drama between the Grecian widows and the regular ones, because your name could kind of lay out, where your loyalties lie. It's interesting then that you'd have a man like Stephen that gets stoned. Now, of course, Stephanus means victory crown. It's pretty cool. His name means that as he wins it. But yeah, there's a lot of those those elements that are there. Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah. Certainly, certainly. Well, there's a certain reality, and I think our enemy learned that persecution coming down hard just caused the church to grow. She spread. And it's the softer things that tends to catch everyone up. Yeah, that conviction, the conviction of a Stephen, a conviction of a Philip, a conviction of a Paul before the emperor of Rome, a conviction to stand up no matter what. We have to have that kind of a strength. And it's interesting reading about and seeing men that gave their lives just to provide an English Bible. Because the reality is, I don't know how much of that Bible he really knew or followed. But it's a commitment. It's a curious thing. We can be challenged in our lives, and it's best we be ready for it. Well, anyway, that kind of sets the table for this section. Any other thoughts? Is there anyone that needs the Lord's Supper this evening? Okay. Is there anything else we need to mention? Okay. If not, Eric, would you close us in prayer?